Anu, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lara Bryden. Lara is a naturopathic doctor and the best-selling author of the Period Repair Manual and the Hormone Repair Manual. She also treats so many women with conditions like PCOS, endometriosis, and perimenopause. Welcome, Lara.
Hi, Anu. Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure to have you here. So let's kick off, because this is obviously your arena. What is the one thing you wish women knew about their hormones?
One of my key messages is that regular ovulation, as in having a regular natural menstrual cycle, is how women make hormones. It's how we make our hormones. I get so many patients and followers asking me, how do I boost progesterone? How do I do this? Well, it all comes back to supporting ovulation. And we tend to think about, ovulation is just for making a baby, but it's not. It's how female physiology works. It's a core event, a central event of the menstrual cycle and the central event of hormonal health in many ways.
What might some of the other symptoms be if somebody is having periods, they're not on birth control, they're having periods, but they're not ovulating every cycle?
Yeah, it's actually not that difficult to figure out. If anyone's willing to go that extra step and track their cycles with temperatures, basal body temperatures, either just the old style thermometer under your tongue in the morning when you're still lying in bed before you get up, or you can wear lots of the wearable devices now. There's a few various period tracking apps and devices that will track body temperature and then tell you for sure whether you're ovulating or not. So that's the most gold standard way to figure out if you're ovulating. But other signs might be, as I said, if the flow is unusual in some way, if it's longer than 7 days or heavier than 80 milliliters over all the days of the flow, that can indicate an ovulatory. Another indication might be if the cycle is outside of the parameters of the sort of normal, getting a period every 21 to in adult women 35 days. If it's outside of that, cycles might be anovulatory, although especially shorter than 21 days is unlikely to be an ovulatory cycle. Longer could be, especially in younger women. They could just be taking a while to ovulate. Other signs might be just not noticing any of the normal fertile signs, no fertile mucus, no kind of changes with breasts in the post-ovulatory luteal phase.
Often women who, when they start tracking ovulation, they can feel it. They know kind of when they've ovulated. They can kind of get a sense of that. So that idea of knowing if and when you ovulate is called body literacy, which I love. It's just such a great term. It's just such an important aspect, really, of our health. So I would encourage listeners to, if they haven't quite tried to tune into that already, just try to get a sense. It's not complicated. Do you have anything to add to that? Other signs of anovulatory cycles that you work with your patients?
I think periods can be harder. I mean, with anovulatory cycles, essentially everything can be magnified, and what we classically see, as you so beautifully described, is the beginning, when a woman first comes into starting the menstrual cycle, that anovulatory, we have that matching tail off at the end of perimenopause. And it's not just the random unpredictability, but of course emotional symptoms of lack of progesterone, which is made. You mentioned something very interesting before, which was about the fact that if women are on birth control, or certain, the majority of types of birth control, that they don't ovulate. From your perspective, why is that a problem?
Because ovulation is how we make hormones. So when we switch off ovulation with hormonal birth control, which is, as you just said, most methods work that way. That's their intention, is to switch off ovulation. Then the idea was, we'll switch off ovulation. That will obviously switch off our main hormones, estradiol and progesterone. And then the thinking was, but we'll just replace those with these synthetic versions of the hormones that are present in the hormonal birth control, kind of with this wishful thinking idea, well, surely that'll be good enough, or we're close enough, like kind of fudging it as like, progestin is somehow, close enough to progesterone, it should be fine. But as you know, that wishful thinking did not play out well. So we've now come through a few generations of this, of robbing women of their own hormones, thinking it's good enough to give them back these pseudo hormones, which I guess to give some examples, the real examples, the strongest ones for me are to do with progesterone and the brain. So real progesterone that we either make by ovulating, or we make during pregnancy, or we can take as a body identical or bioidentical hormone of some form. But real progesterone, importantly, converts to a metabolite. It's called a neurosteroid. People don't have to remember that word, but it's a very it's a type of hormone metabolite that's very active in the nervous system, and progesterone makes one called allopregnanolone, and it is
very important for the brain. It does a lot in the brain. It changes the shape of the brain, and it's generally quite calming. I think it's quite important for the brain. No progestin, or none of the so-called progesterones in hormonal birth control, the progestins, none of them convert to allopregnanolone, which could explain findings that we're getting, for example, that women on hormonal birth control have altered brain structure compared to women who cycle naturally. There was a study a few years ago, a Canadian study, that found that women who took hormonal birth control as a teenager went on to have a 3 times higher risk of depression even after they were no longer taking the medication. So that's because hormones like our main estrogen, estradiol, and progesterone affect the brain during that puberty developmental phase of the brain, quite irreversibly to some extent. They mature the brain, and then on an ongoing basis, our brain is expecting to have those hormones. So if you really think about it, the 3 generations of women that have been sort of lost out on these hormones, it's happening at a scale that is quite mind-boggling. So that's my main concern. I'd like women to enjoy the benefits of their own hormones. What has happened to women with regard to hormonal birth control? If you think about it, what a strange thing that would be if we said to men, look, from the time you're a young teenager, 14, we're gonna give you this medication that switches off your testosterone, and then we're gonna give you back this hormone that's kind of like testosterone, but also a lot like estrogen, and it could affect your mood and your brain health, but don't worry about it, because that's what we do. That's what it really does. All the other boys take it, so it'll be fine. So I suspect we're coming to the end of this era of contraceptive drugs used in this way. As you said, there's other ways to use them. There is the hormonal IUD, which does, in most cases, does not entirely switch off ovulation, so still gives women access to their hormones. And hopefully the future will bring even more methods of avoiding pregnancy that do not involve shutting down a woman's entire hormonal system.
Right, it's such a huge thing, isn't it? And what do you say to women who need some form of contraception? What would you?
Yeah, well, just that. So there's things coming. So already, just as a brief survey, condoms are great. Like every few months, I do another social media post about condoms, just to kind of get a sense of the mood out there. If people are not using them, why not? The other method is fertility awareness method, which is based on the fact that as women, we're only fertile. Technically, we're only fertile 1 day per cycle, but that does stretch out to 5 or 6 days because of sperm, how long sperm lives. But that's a growing field. So it's not the old calendar method, which is sort of a dubious, efficacy. There's ways to do it where a lot of people have started to rely on that as their main method of avoiding pregnancy. There's the 2 types of coil or IUD, copper IUD or hormonal IUD, which are a bit better. And there's more methods coming. So it's coming soon. I think there's something. It's essentially like a temporary vasectomy where they inject this. It's just in the doctor's room. It's just involves a local anesthetic. It's quite a simple procedure for a man, and it blocks the sperm from getting into the semen, and then at some future date, they have a second injection potentially to wash that away, or have to repeat it every few years. So something like that. Don't you agree? That could be a game changer when that comes onto the market. It's undergone its first clinical trial in Australia currently. So
Oh, it's so important to find a solution because obviously when the birth control first came out, there was a sense, I suppose, of the freedom of women were no longer shackled to fertility. Like they could actually have a separation between their own lives and their their sex lives and their fertile lives. But everything you've said, and it's massive. And there are women, and of course for things like the bones, for osteoporosis, it's not the same as our own hormones. So these are long-term conditions that are happening, and we're all living longer. And what would you say to the women out there with endometriosis, for example, some of whom are being given the pill back to back, without a break, cycles? What alternatives might you suggest?
Yeah, so of course a lot of women are prescribed the pill not for contraception but to manage symptoms, which is valid. An example might be hormone suppression with the pill has been a strategy for endometriosis, and it can sometimes work for that. It doesn't always work for that. In some of my writing around endometriosis, I do make the point that the condition is actually not a hormonal disease, so treating it with hormone suppression is not ideal. There are lots of other ways to manage endometriosis, including treating the immune system, and then potentially with my patients getting them to the point where if once we've reduced the inflammation of endometriosis, they can then enjoy the benefits of their own menstruals and making their own estrogen and not have that flare up the disease. So there's a lot of other sort of non-hormonal strategies for endometriosis. The other condition that the pill might be prescribed for is for a condition like polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS to so-called regulate the menstrual cycle, and that's the one that irks me the most because the pill cannot do that. And I don't know about you, but a lot of my patients and followers, when they find out that the medication they've been prescribed to regulate their cycle cannot actually do that, they feel pretty betrayed. I feel like the telling of women, over the last few decades that the pill can regulate their cycle, telling that lie was not necessary for anything really. I mean, I think we could have said, suppressing your hormones with the pill can relieve certain symptoms, but the result will be you don't actually have a menstrual cycle and you don't make any hormones. I think women could have accepted that and sort of weighed up the balance. And so if anyone's sort of listening to this and not sure what I mean, I'll just say any of the combined hormonal birth control methods, so that's any of the estrogen-containing methods, whether it's the pill or the NuvaRing or the patch, they essentially what they do is they induce a fake bleed. Well, it's a real bleed, but it's not a menstrual cycle. Under the influence of the synthetic estrogen, women will build up a uterine lining and then shed it based purely on the time dosing of the medication, not on anything that their own body is doing. And importantly, there's no medical reason to bleed monthly on hormonal birth control. If the purpose of a monthly cycle is to ovulate monthly, and as we were saying earlier, to make hormones, to make estrogen and progesterone on a monthly basis, and for all the benefits they give us. But the contraceptive drugs, there's really no reason they can just be taken continuously and have a bleed once in a while. And actually, again, a lot of women on the pill, when they find out they didn't have to be having this monthly bleed, feel quite betrayed. So women are getting a little grumpy about some of this, and I don't blame them. It's time to start using, I think, correct words and terms for what we're doing in women's health.
No, that's so important, isn't it? And there's about the precision of our language, and the more that women know that they've kind of been made to know, the more important that this becomes. And I suppose even with something like endometriosis, it could be the case that yes, it's driven by hormones and inflammation. Maybe hormone balance will help them as well as sorting out the inflammation. But this idea that they have to, what their own body is doing, that's the way forward is quite strong. It's kind of crazy. And I love the fact that you have explained to women the difference between, a withdrawal bleed, essentially, and having their own menstrual cycle. I mean, in your experience, how many women get this? How many women know the difference?
About the general population now, what the perception will be, because as you know, even a lot of doctors and journalists and even scientists don't seem to understand the difference. I mean, I find when women are presented with the information, they understand, get it quite readily. But just to give some examples, there's still some science happening. I'll occasionally see a paper where they were trying to study the effect of hormones, for example, on mood or something, and they've lumped together, women on hormonal birth control with women cycling naturally, kind of all as one data set. I'm like, that's like women on hormonal birth control don't have hormones. I mean, just to really illustrate this, like for anyone who's still kind of maybe not quite getting what I'm saying. So for anyone who's on a combined estrogen method of hormonal birth control, if you were to do a blood test for your estradiol, your main estrogen, and progesterone, you would have none, essentially pretty much menopausal levels of those hormones, because the contraceptive drug that is supposedly replacing those hormones is not the same hormones. It won't be picked up on the blood test. So, I hope that, starts to illustrate the differences. And I think it will change. I really do predict that, going forward, we might move into an era where we're happier to have women ovulate regularly. I have a social media hashtag that I like to use called the right to ovulate. So I think this few decades we've had of just thinking the best method is to suppress it all, shut it all down, was partly, if you agree with us, but it was sort of this attitude that, female hormones are just too complicated. They're in the too hard basket, so let's just shut it all down. And to be fair, the use of the invention of the contraceptive pill and the beginning of the use of these medications was put in place before really scientists even understood what was happening with the menstrual cycle. So what we've learned about the menstrual cycle in the last few decades, if that had been known back in the 50s and 60s, some scientists probably would have said, put their hand up, wait, I don't think this is a good idea to shut this down. It seems like women might need their hormones.
I love what you said about the latest research where they lumped together a bunch of women who were having natural periods and a bunch of women that were on the pill, because this is a repetition of what happened with menopause when there was synthetic hormones and hormones that are identical in structure to our body's own. And I guess if we want to make sure that we don't create another period, decade or more of just complete confusion, hormonal havoc. We see interviews like this. Are there any other things that you just think are really valuable to
Well, I just wanted to respond to what you were just talking about, how, because of course a lot of your listeners will probably know about the value of bioidentical or body-identical hormones as the type of hormone therapy. So if you're going to use hormone therapy in perimenopause or menopause, I think finally, consensus is it's actually better to use hormones that are identical to real human hormones. The same understanding is not given to young women, right? So there's all this talk about how older women, it's a lot safer to use natural hormones, but young women are still stuck using these definitely not,
synthetic hormones that are used in hormonal birth control. So it's kind of a double standard, I think. And in some ways, I would say young women, especially teenagers, even more, I'd say teenagers are harmed by synthetic hormones more than menopausal women ever were, if you know what I mean. But sort of, you know what I mean? There's this kind of, we've fought the battle for natural hormones in one age group, but kind of forgotten about all the young girls.
Well, I think that the battle's still going on in many parts of the world, even for menopausal women. And, I think there are probably still a lot of places where women aren't routinely being told the difference between bioidentical hormones or synthetic hormones. And then you're quite right. There's this whole other group of women that are just left out there. So it's...
The other thing I'll say to everyone is that, and obviously I've written a couple of books about this very thing, which is that it is possible to achieve symptomless periods without the use of contraceptive drugs. In most cases, that's been my kind of overwhelming clinical experience, especially young girls, especially, those heavy periods, the period pain, the acne of young teenagers, that can be addressed with other treatments that are not the pill. I can really assure you. Just for example, we can put this in the show notes. There was just this week, so we're recording this in September. There was a new study about using zinc, a new randomized clinical trial of using zinc to treat teenage period pain, and that's an example of something that's so simple, so inexpensive, so safe, and so there really are options for women and for parents and girls. It's not a pill or nothing situation like we've been told for the last few generations.
What are some of the tips that you could tell women that they could implement now in their lives?
To have in pursuit of a better period? Well, I guess one important understanding is that our menstrual health is not separate from our general health. So whatever it is that our general health needs, that's what our periods need. And that's why there's no one size fits all. So just to give, some diverse examples. So there's lots of young women out there who've lost their period to undereating, they're undereating, they're, that underfueling, then that's the main thing that they need to remedy to regain their period. Then kind of almost conversely on the other side of things, there's women who have irregular periods or anovulatory cycles due to PCOS or due to kind of a pre-diabetic insulin-resistant condition. And they might need sort of the opposite strategy. They might need reducing sugar and maybe looking at some gentle intermittent fasting and some supplements to improve blood sugar control to regulate their periods and get their ovulation back. And then, there's all the women who there's something inflammatory standing between them and painless, symptomless periods. One tip I would give for anyone who's struggling with pain or heavy flow is do think about trying a few months off normal cow's dairy. I talk about that in both my books, Period Repair Manual and Hormone Repair Manual, just because I think the connection is actually via the immune system. In some people, normal cow's dairy, by that I mean cow's dairy that has the A1 casein, which is really only in a couple breeds of cows. So there's quite a bit of cow dairy and goat and sheep dairy that doesn't seem to be inflammatory in the same way. But for some women, that sort of inflammatory reaction can make periods heavier, can create premenstrual mood symptoms, can worsen period pain. So it's another example of something quite simple that addresses general health that then translates into better period health. There was actually just a study about that, linking milk allergy in childhood to the frequency of premenstrual mood symptoms in adulthood. Which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That's that same kind of inflammatory reaction as a kid, except you didn't outgrow it. It just kind of moved to manifest or show itself in certain areas of your health, particularly period menstrual health.
And you made a link between our metabolic health and our sex hormones. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, so that's I mentioned to you that my next book is going to be all on metabolic health or maintaining healthy insulin sensitivity. If the audience knows what that is, it just means good blood sugar control, sort of reversing out of a pre-diabetic state potentially. That can be very important for maintaining good hormone health, primarily because having insulin resistance or prediabetes can impair ovulation and prevent the main event of the cycle, which is ovulation, and therefore the making of progesterone. So that's sort of one of the key ways that metabolic health can impact female hormones. It goes in the other direction too. Female hormones do really